One of the most exciting lenses that I've ever had the privilege to
On paper, this thing does look impressive.
It's just a great lens. Everybody should have that lens.
I'm gonna say something that might be divisive.
This lens is a stinking joke.
There is no perfect lens, and there are no bad lenses.
I don't think this is a really great lens.
It was sharp.
Too flat looking? Just like any tool, there are the wrong and the right tools for the job.
Do they look good? Yes, they do.
Over-designed, it's over-corrected.
Like, I love the look.
Absolutely atrocious.
Yes, there are lenses that have a whole bunch of qualities you may not want in your image, but they're only bad to you if you don't want them in your film. One man's garbage is another man's gold. If you really take the craft of cinematography seriously, then your journey needs to include increasing your knowledge and exercising control over your image. What's that saying again?
Now I know.
And knowing is half the battle.
Yeah, that's the one. You may have found yourself the image maker watching a film or TV series next to somebody with no insight into imaging. While you may be able to pick out anamorphic from spherical or vintage from modern, the person next to you may not see any difference until it's pointed out to them. But if it's never pointed out, then what role do these differences make? To answer that question, and many others in this video, I've tapped lens royalty, Mr. Jay Holben, cinematographer and co-author of this book, the Cine Lens Manual, the modern Bible of cinema optics. And here is what Jay has to say about lens choice.
It's the difference between Roger Deakins and Greg Fraser, or it's the difference between Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott. They're creative artists who are making 1,000 decisions a day to tell the story the way that they want to tell the story. And does the audience really care if the actor's wearing a black shirt or a dark blue shirt or maybe a brown shirt? Probably not. But in the general visual scheme of it, brown is adding a little bit more warmth, and we want to make sure that at this point in the journey, we're getting a little bit more, less cold and a little bit more warmth into it. Those are the decisions that we make that influence how the whole story is told. And if those decisions don't matter, then what the fuck are we doing here? Because that's the artist's choice, right? Is the audience able to articulate it? 99% of the time, no. But audiences will know there is a difference between a Ridley Scott movie and a Steven Spielberg movie. And if they're sitting side by side looking, they can tell that there's a difference between Greg Fraser photography and Roger Deakins photography. Because those artists are making those choices, and those choices are informed by their own aesthetics. Whether that be, I want it clean and sharp and high contrast, and I want to get the most pristine image possible. Or I want this to feel more messed up and aberrant and more like a hazy memory.
This is all to say that subtlety in the details has more of an emotional effect than you might guess at first glance. By understanding all of the important qualities of a lens, you can start to control for emotional and artistic preferences. Much of what we'll be discussing in this video have been mined by 3 very important sources. As I already mentioned, Jay Holben and his book, The Cine Lens Manual, has been my primary source of technical and historical information. Jay has also advised me on many of the testing methods that we are going to feature in this video. Additionally, there are things I had to omit from this video for simply just time reasons, all of which, and much more, can be found in this book. So if you're serious about a career as a cinematographer, then I cannot imagine you not owning this book. I don't just recommend it, I actually insist that you buy it. There's going to be a link to it in the description below. My second phoned a friend was Mr. Matthew Duclos of Duclos Lenses in Los Angeles. And I spent some time with Matthew recently, and his insight and experience with lens design, testing, and servicing is so world-class that it has made Duclos one of the top cinema lens servicing companies in the entire world. So my sincere thank you to both of you gentlemen for taking the time to ensure the information in this video is technically accurate. Beyond that, I'm also pulling from my decade as a cinematographer and the various tests that I have had to perform over and over, and also the jobs where I've made both good and poor lens choices. My job today is definitely not to advise you on what lenses you should or shouldn't shoot with. The goal of this video is to put the knowledge and control into your hands. And while this video is formatted for working cinematographers, it should be of equal value to really anyone who shoots videos or photos. everyone deserves to understand their tools. So let's get into it. This video is divided into 3 segments, including subsections, so that you can just go directly to the content that is most relevant to you or your level of knowledge. And the first part is about the science of optics. And this is a crucial part of the understanding of picture quality. Without knowing why you are seeing what you are seeing, well, it's going to be a lot more difficult to solve for aberrations or manage the creative look of your film. And there is footage of hundreds of tests online. I'm sure you've seen them, but if you don't know what you're looking for, then they're really nothing more than just pretty pictures. And the second part of this video is focused on how to test and evaluate lenses on your own with no specialized optical testing equipment. The most important caveat of this entire video needs to be stated right here. The point is not to evaluate lenses down to their technical minutia. The point is to teach you broad skills to identify and control for the most common attributes that you can visually observe with readily available and affordable tools. Diving deeper requires tools and skills that are far outside the scope and purpose of this video and primarily applies to those servicing lenses, not shooting with them. What I will be teaching is how to evaluate a lens regarding its perceived image attributes. The third and final section will be evaluating lenses based on build, handling, and really any special adaptations you may need to factor in. And the last caveat I wish to state is that this video took nearly a year of researching and near Herculean fact-checking. Will I get everything perfectly correct? Well, I actually hope so, but this is such a deep topic that I most certainly will have missed some details. This video, despite its contents and length, is an introduction to lens testing. It is not a comprehensive course. I cannot understate my recommendation enough to buy the Cine Lens Manual as the only verifiable and accessible source for the most complete and accurate information. Okay, part 1, here we go.
Giddy up! All right.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. This is a lens. And, well, these are lenses, right? And my glasses. But if these are lenses, then what's this all about? Well, in simplest terms, every lens starts off as this, a singlet lens, a simple lens element like my glasses here. And practically speaking, in order to get an image, we only need one lens, or no lens at all, just a hole. The question is, why do we need any more than this, like in this Tokina lens, which has 13 individual elements inside? Well, there's 2 reasons for this. One is to correct for optical defects. And the second is to actually allow the lens to focus or zoom or just focus better. Let's take a look at an image from a single lens before we go any deeper. This is a single lens, which I've just adhered to a piece of foam core. And what I did is I taped this to the window of our studio, and then I blocked out all the remaining light. And this forces the light outside to go through the lens. And whammo bammo, we have an inverted image projected on my roll of white seamless. This, some of you may recognize as camera obscura, the very simplest form of imaging with a lens. It's super cool, but doesn't produce the sharpest images, and can be full of super funky aberrations. The reason it's inverted is vital to learning about lens anomalies, because most light entering a lens enters at an angle. So let's talk about why that's relevant. Lenses work by a phenomenon called refraction. If I just take my glass of water here, you can see how things are warped when looking through the water. And it's the opposite of reflection. If we trace a ray of light through a simple biconvex or converging lens, well, 2 things occur. Light rays bend in respect to the curvature of the lens. Parallel rays will exit at an angle, and angled rays will exit in parallel. Rays entering at an angle will exit the lens on the opposite end. In a theoretically perfect lens, all light entering the lens would converge to a single point. But they don't. And this forms the basis of all major aberrations you will encounter in lenses. And I'll show you how each lens design addresses each aberration. But first, here's an introduction to them. Here are the 7 primary aberrations. Spherical aberration. This is when the light path angle changes in respect to where it enters the lens. The light entering at the edges exits more sharply than in the center. And this is going to cause blurring and haloing. You next have lateral and axial chromatic aberration. This is really 2 aberrations in one and is the prism effect. Light entering glass will be dispersed as when shining a light through a prism. This means that blue light arrives in front of the image plane and red arrives behind the image plane. This presents itself as either colored fringing, either vertically, horizontally, or both. And most commonly, you're going to observe this in areas of high contrast. The next aberration is named coma, because it resembles the shape of a comet, and only affects the edges of the image. It occurs when light enters the periphery of the lens at an angle and arrives at a different distance than that of the center. This is more dominant in normal to wider lenses. Next up, we have astigmatism, and this is because light isn't hitting the lens in just one axis, it's actually three-dimensional. And this again is an oblique aberration like that of coma, where one axis is not hitting the image plane at the same length as the other. This presents itself as one axis being blurred or even ghosting of one axis. None of the lenses that I tested have exhibited this, so here's an example of what you might see from a lens that does. Following this, we have field curvature. This is when light is exiting a spherical lens, it will project relative to the same curve. So if you have a flat sensor, the image will progressively become more blurred towards the edges. This is identical to how it enters as well. Here is an example. If your lens is focused to a wall 6 meters away, 6 meters forms a curve to the camera. The furthest edges may be, for example, another meter or two beyond that. In many cases, the curve isn't a perfect arc, but instead a wavy line. Regardless of shape, stopping down and increasing your depth of field is a way to ensure edge-to-edge sharpness regardless of the curvature. We now move on to distortion, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but a function of lens angle of view relative to the subject. It's a common misnomer that wide-angle lenses have more distortion than long lenses. What you most often see is the subject's relative distance to the camera and not actual lens-based distortion. Still, some lenses can be more linear while others can stretch the image in various places. A classic example is a fisheye lens versus a rectilinear wide angle. Now, both of these lenses are 17mm focal length. But the fisheye gives you a greater field of view without vignetting at the cost of barrel distortion, looking as though one has just taken a rectilinear lens and stretched it across an inflated balloon. Inversely, pincushion distortion will magnify the edges relative to the center, and this occurs primarily in telephoto lenses. Undesired distortion is mostly common in zoom lenses due to the complex nature of the design. However, distortion overall is mostly minimal in normal lenses. There are some aberrations that occur not just with the optics, but how they interplay with the lens housing, and they are as follows. The most common, of course, being vignetting. There are actually several reasons why vignetting happens, some based on lens construction and some based on the inverse square law physics. All you need to know is that light at the edges is either being cut off or diluted relative to the center. We also have mechanical vignetting, which we're going to cover later in this video, but this is just basically what causes the cat-eye bokeh towards the edges of the frame. This occurs because light entering the lens at an extreme angle only sees part of the entrance pupil. In the same way, whereas an anamorphic entrance pupil takes the shape of what it sees or goes through. Beyond this, the other aberrations we primarily concern ourselves with are not necessarily aberrations, as they are, by their very nature, normal from a physical perspective. They are, however, often troublesome when we don't want them, and they are flaring. Now, this occurs because not 100% of the light makes it through the lens. The lens surface itself will reflect some of the light back, including the exit side. Depending on the angle, the interior housing will also reflect light, as will the sensor itself. So in essence, flaring can be noticeably worse shooting digitally than on film. And flares come in two major flavors. One are spot flares, and these are the ones that show you the representation of each lens element in the lens. You also have veiling flares, which wash out the contrast of an image when a bright light source is just outside the frame. Lastly, we have breathing, which, as a note for the photographers watching, this is really only of concern to video shooters. As the focus element is working, it is in a very small way changing the field of view. Cine lenses of quality, especially the very expensive ones, will have other elements or ways to counter this effect. Now's the time to explain how optical design can solve these aberrations, and also when it can't, and what you can do about it. The big takeaway here is that, like many anamorphic lenses, edge distortion and aberrations can actually really add to the texture. So for portraits, especially those that are center framed, etc., etc. So again, aberrations may possibly be a negative attribute. However, it depends on a number of factors, which we are going to explore later in this video. It's important to understand each part of your lens and how light is actually interacting with these elements. This way, you're in a better position to analyze why something is happening and how to solve for unwanted attributes. That. It really depends on what you're after. So let's say you find an aberration that is unwanted. Well, what can you do about it? More than half of the aberrations are aperture-based, which means that stopping down the lens reduces or eliminates them. Now, this is either great news or terrible news depending on what your image objectives are. Some aberrations are accentuated near the edges of the image, so shooting with smaller sensors or film sizes may actually crop out the bad edges. To no one's surprise, spending more money fixes many things, like aspheric designs. Lenses like the Zeiss Otis, etc. will have major aberrations reduced enough that they will be either eliminated or hidden from general human vision when used practically. Subjectively, be good at knowing what is worth fussing over, because seeing something on a chart is not the same as seeing it used practically. Okay, so now you should have a solid understanding of not just what you're looking for in a lens, but also why they are there and how to control for them. This should be your first and most important asset when starting to choose the lenses that you're going to work with. This next section is intended to teach you how to identify each lens's visual attribute or aberration with resources you either already have or can easily acquire. And there are two steps to this process. The first being the actual tests that exploit these qualities of a lens and bring them to the forefront. The second is to bring these lenses into a real-world scene that reflects the project you are about to shoot. You'll then be able to see the lens qualities played out in the real world, where you can actually assess their importance or relevance. For the purposes of this demonstration, we'll be looking at tests that I've done with 4 different 50mm lenses, all of which are full frame on a full frame Sony FX9, which will be an important distinction because we are seeing much to the edge of the image circle, whereas Super 35 would crop into the center, avoiding much of the problem edges. And let me state this, you do not need to test your lenses on full frame cameras. You do, however, absolutely need to test your lenses on the very same camera you are shooting with. I'm just simply choosing a full-frame camera for this video to magnify the aberrations so they are more clear to you as you are learning. Going forward, here are some rules of engagement when lens testing. Number 1, document everything. Every attribute, every aberration, every small discovery. If you think you will remember in the future, you won't. And that includes marking the individual set with serial numbers. 2 different sets of these same lenses can provide different experiences. You should create a document that allows you to note every observation, and it should start with the entire lens name, its aperture range, special markings on versions, plus the serial number. I also encourage you to record every aspect of your recording medium. That is, your camera, your sensor, your codec, frame rate, bit rate, picture profile, lookup table, film stock, etc. More recommendations on this can be found in the Cine Lens Manual. And it's worth noting the lighting elements as well if you can. Put as much info on the slate as you possibly can. All lens tests should be done with the lens wide open. If you're short on time, then this is the most important. The optical experience wide open is a turbocharger for the lens attributes. Time permitting, you can do tests at various stop intervals, but wide open is absolutely the priority. And as addendum to this, if you're testing at other stops, do not change your lighting or the ISO or add any filtration, and that includes neutral density, because this will all affect your result. Instead, change your frame rate or your shutter angle to compensate. If you want to know more about this, of course, you can find that in the Cine Lens Manual. It is worth again restating that you absolutely need to test your lenses with the same camera system that you will be shooting your project with. It doesn't matter if it's full frame, Super 35, or Super 8. A Super 35 test for a full frame shoot will most certainly be pointless, as would the reverse. Using the same camera or film stock also rules out or defines any camera-based aberrations you may experience. Next would be to shoot in the highest quality codec available to you. Compression artifacts or low bit depth footage can make otherwise sharp objects appear soft or distorted. So shooting in RAW or ProRes would be my suggestion, and to avoid H.264 or H.265. Now, there are some exceptions, like Sony's XAVC, that is available in their cinema products. Canon, Panasonic, and other video cameras have similar robust codecs, if you have no option for RAW or ProRes. And finally, be prepared for this to be a slow and meticulous process. You will often need to repeat the same tests more than once, or find new scenes to test in order to arrive at some sort of conclusive observation. Doing this properly will likely take you an entire day, if not multiple days, depending on how many sets of lenses or scenarios to test against. All right, so let's now bust into the testing methods and the tools. Let's go through each testing system. I'm going to introduce the methodology and explain what we are looking for with the test. This is one of the most telling tests you can perform. In this system, you just simply need to purchase a couple sets of tungsten twinkle Christmas lights, if you can find them. If you're doing a comprehensive test, you will need tungsten and not LED. LED will flicker at various frame rates and shutter angles. But for those learning and doing more personal level tests, you can buy an inexpensive box or two of LED curtain lights. This will give you a complete edge-to-edge grid of points of light. And I suspect the majority of the viewers in this video are not preparing to shoot a feature film, and thus I am also using LED here because it was quickly accessible to me. You can use whatever method you like to string these up. For me, I just used a seamless backdrop and then weighted each line by tying it to another light stand. It's a little bit DIY, but it does the job. Choose your own adventure here, but it's important that each line is suitably taut and that you measure out the top and the bottom distances so that they are equally spaced as possible. It doesn't need to be precision perfect, but do your best. Next, you're going to illuminate the light curtain in a suitably dark space with a dark background. Pitch black isn't necessary, but there should be no detail in the image behind the lights. Set up your camera so that whatever lens you have covers the entire grid edge to edge, ideally around 3 meters away. Make sure that your camera is level so that you aren't experiencing any keystone distortion. As a reminder again, that your primary test will involve opening your iris to wide open. And this is where aberrations will be always most evident. Hit record on your camera and start by racking to close focus and then rack smoothly all the way to infinity focus and stop the recording. If time permits, you can now repeat the test as far up the stop scale as you like. Most often, things clean up sufficiently well by 5/6. Once you get to T16 and above, the image begins to degrade again, but only for one reason, and that is diffraction. We won't cover diffraction in this video because why are you shooting at T16 anyways? Let's look at the footage now. My favorite way to do this is to bring it into your NLE of choice. Convert it to 709 if you've already shot in log, and now you can scrub through the focus. You're going to be looking for a couple things. The most obvious being the shape and texture of the bokeh. Is it soft and even, or does it contain rings or hard edges? Most people will say softer is better. However, there is a value in having bokeh with a hard ring edge. And the hard ring edge is a byproduct of overcorrected spherical aberration, which is not necessarily something done in the manufacturing, but another aberration sort of onto itself. Let's take a look at two opposing lenses outside. What you should take away from this is that the harder ringed bokeh of the overcorrected spherical aberration of the Zeiss CP2 lens certainly makes the background feel a lot more chaotic. Comparing that to the Tokina Vista Prime, which has very creamy bokeh and seems to bleed into each other. This is a calming feeling, one of love and harmony. This highlights a point we made earlier in the video that much of the power of lenses is in the reinforcing of subtext or tuning into the subconscious. For example, I would use a lens like the CP2 anytime I want to make the audience feel uneasy. Anytime there is a character or a situation that emotes chaos or uncertainty. You can also take the character from here and then as they arc through the story, introduce a softer look. This is nothing the audience will be able to point out, but it most certainly will make them feel something when used correctly. You can also go back to your stop-down examples to see how the bokeh shape changes once you engage the iris. This has more to do about the iris blade shapes than it does about how many blades the iris has. Questions you want to ask yourself is, does it start to immediately show a stop sign shape, or is it continually round throughout the range? As a rule of thumb, round throughout the range costs more. As an aside, another fun test you can do to analyze the bokeh character, especially as it changes based on where the focus lands, is to make a chart like this in, say, Photoshop, and place your camera at an angle to your monitor. Now you're going to roll the focus, and as you're rolling the focus, you're going to expose how the bokeh changes characteristics throughout the focal range. The next thing I'm looking for is the distance between each line of lights. In almost all lenses, you will see that distance becomes irregular. The most vital visual here is the unique elliptical cat-eye bokeh towards the corners. Some lenses will exhibit this more than others, which you can see in somewhat extremes on my Helios 44-2. This is called pupil or mechanical occlusion because it is occluding light. That means that the light entering the entrance pupil at a steep angle only sees a portion of the entrance pupil. Let me show you with my Helios. So your eyeball is now the sensor. And when you look straight on, you see a circle until I pan the lens, at which point the circle becomes elliptical. This is one of the many drivers of the vintage swirly bokeh look. However, vintage optics susceptible to astigmatism and field curvature will exploit this the most. A friend of mine used this to his advantage on a music video to give an almost funky anamorphic look on a spherical lens. No modern perfect lens would have given him this result. The next thing I'm looking for is coma. The best way to find this is to stop your video at a point in which your lights are now perfectly in focus. Now zoom in if you need and look at the edges. Coma will present itself in a few ways, and it's not always the classic comet shape. Another common coma shape is angel wings. And you'll see this on some other lenses that I've tested, as well as on my camera obscura image. Coma, unfortunately, cannot be corrected through stopping down. At best, it can be reduced by an experienced technician. Maybe. The next thing I'm looking for in my bokeh is chromatic aberration. This isn't necessarily the main test for it, but it's certainly one that complements it. Lateral chromatic aberration will show up on the edges, whereas longitudinal chromatic aberration will tint the entire blur patch. The final thing I'm going to be looking for in my bokeh are onion rings or any dots or lines. The onion rings come from any time a lens has an aspheric element. That's going to show up as onion rings. When it comes to sort of dots and lines, that could be any sort of dust or scratches on the elements, especially those closer to the exit pupil. Certainly something to look into when you're physically handling the lens. You can also get a small sense of distortion by panning and tilting the camera to see how the image warps through the move. The next test is the popular flare test. By now, I'm sure you've seen 1,000 videos online of people shining flashlights into a lens. In my opinion, this borders on entertainment and is not conclusive information for me at all. Allow me to show you how to get more information about your lens flares. There are a couple more flare types than we cover in this video, so for additional information, again, please refer to the Cine Lens Manual. In place of a flashlight, I, as well as Jay, recommends that you take a small Fresnel light. A classic RE150 or 300 will work best. Either way, the lights should be flooded out completely. Do not spot your light. You're going to place this at the center of your frame and ensure that your camera is leveled and centered on the light. The camera should be placed around 2 to 3 meters from the light. Ideally, you want the light in the top part of your frame as to reveal more spot flaring. Additionally, make sure that the background is as dark as you can make it so that you can see the flares more clearly. Exposure also plays a role. If you underexpose, you can crush down many flares, which is either good or bad depending on your creative intent. In this test, we just simply want to know what's all there. Play with your camera settings to get the exposure that reads the most amount of flaring without being overexposed. Now you're going to hit record and pan left to right a few times. You'll notice a lot of different types of flares happening here, so let's break them all down. The most important flare to contend with is the veiling flare. As mentioned in part 1, it can really wash out your image, significantly affecting contrast and image clarity. The older and less coated the lens is, the worse this typically is. The second thing you're going to notice are those spot flares. This is where you see the shapes of all of your lens elements superimposed on your image. Very good coatings can reduce this, but there will be a certain amount of light that gets bounced around inside of a lens showing off its shape. Zoom lenses, by their nature, will show this the most because they have more elements to contend with. The third are ghost flares. Whatever hotspot source is causing your flare, be it the sun, a light fixture, or a reflection, it's going to show up as a flare shape. A great example are light bulbs or Fresnel lights. Ghost flares are also the most dominant flare found in smartphone lenses. The third are rainbow or waterfall flares that create a prism effect of light that washes down the image throughout the move. And there's one other flare that I haven't been able to isolate a name for, and is somewhere between the panning motion of a veiling glare and then moving into spot. Matthew Duclos posits that's likely due to light bouncing off of the internal lens housing at a specific angle. This is a flare that only exists within a specific degree. It bursts, then disappears. Let's now discuss how we can use these flares to our advantage. Like any aberration or image distortion, you are removing information for the viewer. You're obscuring it in some way. Or inversely, you are layering more information onto the scene than exists in real life. For me, flaring is most often used to create a nostalgic or filmic effect. Infused in our minds are images of Super 8 home movies or concert footage from the 1970s. Adding flares can help bring authenticity to a period movie set in a particular time. I also use flares to enhance dream sequences. Not specifically dreams, but any time the character gets transported to another world which exists in theirs or someone else's mind. Our visual memories are not precise, and flares are one way of masking the preciseness of the recorded image. I used this effect on a film recently where the majority of the film was about perfection, and I shot much of the film with the very perfect Fujinon Premista 28-100 T29. However, in one of the key dream sequences, I used a really funky Ingenue Paris 35mm f2.5 from the 1950s. As I dolly through the shot, the flares from the sun create this wonderful waterfall of light. I also used flares in my fashion film Shaman with my digital and film cameras to communicate a sense of mysticism and desert heat. Veiling flares can lead to a sense of romanticism by lifting the blacks and lowering contrast. We again need to use our imagination to make sense of what we're seeing. When you want to communicate a feeling more than detail, this is a good way to do it. What I'm not saying here is that flares are good and you should use them. But if you know the flaring characteristics of your lens, then you know if it will be suitable for the project you are shooting. Where I may want to eliminate or control flares would be any project, be it commercial or narrative, in which you are communicating a clean aesthetic with sharp contrast. This is where I'll also take note of which axes the flares are most apparent, and at what exposure or t-stop can they be crushed out. The test charts you see today are all offsprings of the U.S. Air Force 1951 resolution chart. They contain a series of line pairs called raunchy grating targets, where the lines are referred to as grates, and are expressed in line pairs per millimeter, one being white, the other black. They also contain circles with spoke lines increasing from the center, which are called Siemens stars. Make sure to check the spelling on that. The purpose of these charts are to test, of course, resolving power, but also they're great for testing spherical, chromatic, and astigmatism aberrations. They can also exploit any time a lens may require service. They're also one of the best tools for assessing astigmatism because a lens with this aberration will not be able to focus on all the spokes evenly. A very important caveat to this test is that your observations are subject to your entire workflow of the image capture system, including the resolution of your viewing monitor or your sensor. If your footage is heavily compressed or your camera or monitor doesn't have sufficient resolution, you will never witness the true resolving power of the lens. Here's another important point that I will let Jay Holden make.
What does 4K mean? What line pairs of resolving power do we need for 4K? It's about 80. It's about 86 line pairs. And we're looking at 200 and 400 and scrutinizing that. Ain't nobody need that. So there is a huge difference between technical evaluation, which can give you information about the reproduction of that lens, and real world testing, which again, when you're testing for a project, get your talent, get your props, get that situation, because that's what matters, not really the focus charts. The focus charts and the projection room are great for lens techs to fix the lens, to look at problems and repair it. It's great for initial evaluation of information like, oh, wow, look, that actually does reproduce 200 line pairs to the corner. And then you put it on a face and you're like, oh, I like it.
So by all means, pixel peep the resolution, sure, but also know the limits of when it's necessary and when it's not. It's also critical to not over or underexpose your chart. I encourage you to use a gray chart or a chip chart for exposure calibration. The chart I'm using here is a custom chart provided to me by Duclos lenses. You can have one made for you with a logo of your choice direct from Duclos. A link to that in the description below. The reason you want to do this is that the quality of your printing matters. Imprecise home printing or cheap charts will have very sloppy and inaccurate grates, rendering your findings mostly useless. Additionally, small charts may not completely fill the frame or place the chart at the worst distance for the optical performance of the camera. Here's how you're going to need to set up your resolution chart. First, you want to mount it, obviously, to a flat surface. I've used a whiteboard. Set your chart relative to your focal length. If your lens is less than 40 millimeters, you're going to want it around 1 meter from the focal plane. Lenses above 40 millimeters, you'll want that set to 1.5 to 1.8 meters from the focal plane. Before moving on, you want to be as precise to ensure that the chart is as parallel as possible in both pan and tilt to the camera imager. Next, you're going to set the focus to a clear focus mark on the barrel of your lens. You're now going to adjust your chart or camera to be as sharp as possible at this mark. Next, you want to ensure that you have an evenly lit chart. And you can check this, of course, with your waveform monitor or false color. But here's the problem. How do you know if what you're seeing is lens vignetting or bad lighting? The best way around this is to use a light meter, thus escaping the whole lens sensor system. And next, you're going to just double check the center of your camera and ensure that the chart is filling the frame. Once you have what your eye can determine is the sharpest possible image, and you can use focus peaking for this if you like, check your barrel marks against an actual measurement. If your distance does not agree, then your focus marks are off and the lens likely requires service. Vintage photo glass being the exception here, as these lenses were almost never precisely calibrated. If your focus marks do not line up, or if your lens does not focus to infinity or has other issues with focus, there's a good chance, of course, that your lens needs to be shimmed. And I do not recommend that you do this yourself. Even if they were provided to you with your lens or lens mount, please take this to a qualified technician. So next, you're going to just roll your focus back and forth and ensure that you are not seeing inter or extra focus chromatic aberration. This is the green or red chromatic aberration that is part of the secondary spectrum of light and will often be observed only when slightly out of focus, though it will never be completely eliminated except for lenses known as apochromatic. Now that your focus marks are confirmed and you have the sharpest focus possible, the main thing that we're now looking for in this sharpness of the image is comparing the center to the corners. Wide open, the corners are going to be where the light beams start to fall apart. The first thing we're going to look for, obviously, is resolution. Looking at your line pairs, or grates, look for the line pair where you no longer see individual pairs, but instead a gray box. Then simply go up one level, and that is your effective resolution. For contrast, we are looking at how black are the blacks and how white are the whites. A waveform monitor is helpful here if you don't want to trust your eyes. Next, I'll be looking at spherical aberration, looking for just general softness here, most often towards the edges. I now turn to look for chromatic aberration, and you're looking for color fringing, mostly purple, at the edges of any grate or small lettering. Moving on to astigmatism, now this is the aberration that is most difficult to find. But you want to look at the Siemens star to see if there is more blur in one of the spoke axes than another. The best way to find this, of course, is going to be magnifying the image in post. It'll be very difficult for you to ever see this on a monitor. Now you can redo each test at various f-stops by adjusting your shutter angle and frame rate. Do not adjust your ISO, because this is an opportunity to find your lens's sweet spot, where you get the sharpest image with the least aberrations. We are now going to set up our distortion chart, which is also provided to me by Duclos. Similar to our resolution chart, we want an evenly lit, flat surface. And it's even more critical that we are as parallel and straight to the camera as possible. This is about distortion after all. You can tell some distortions visually, but for subtle distortions, what you're going to need to do is record the image, which you should be doing anyways, and bring that image into post. You're going online to find a similar distortion chart, and then you're going to overlay that onto the screen grab. You should be able to see any subtle differences or evidence of vignetting as well. Speaking of vignetting, as we've discussed, you will have been able to see some vignetting in the previous charts, but it's not very precise. So here's a method to be the most precise. You will need to find a sheet of white plexiglass. With this, you will place the plexi snug up to the lens, and then evenly back illuminate it. The one caveat here is that you cannot slate because of the plexi, so you need to take very accurate and fastidious notes. Now you're going to go through the entire t-stop scale and zoom range, and you can use the waveform monitor to assess. You should be able to use a resolution chart to see breathing, but if you want to have a more quantifiable result, a way to say chart percentage, then here's a test that I created to bring some quantifiable numbers to the breathing. Now, it's not an exact science, but at least it's a telling one. For this, you take a simple wall, frame your camera parallel to it, and focus it. Place some thin spike tape at each edge and mark the exact frame edge with a Sharpie. Now you're going to rack to close focus and repeat the marks with different colored tape. Rack now to infinity and do the same. Now, of course, you're going to be doing this with a blurry image. So again, this isn't an exact science. It's an estimate. So do this to the best of your ability. Now you can measure the distance between the two furthest points and the two closest points. To find your breathing percentage, you simply divide the inside distance by the outside distance and multiply by 100. This number is the maximum breathing, so a smaller focus pull will obviously not amount to the same change. This just gives you an idea of how much the lens breathes overall. The only reliable way to assess and reveal field curvature of a lens is a method used by stills photographers. For this test, you need a road or a parking lot. Ensure, of course, that the road surface is as level as possible. If you have a large enough room, a carpeted surface will also do, but you will likely need a space that is at least 40 feet in length. For this test, you're going to place your camera low to the ground with the horizon on the top of the image. With your iris wide open, hit record and roll focus from infinity to minimum. Repeat the test at all other apertures. The balance of this test happens in post, and there are two methods here. The first is to take the footage into DaVinci Resolve. In the Color panel, go to the Open Effects and select Edge Detect. Adjust the parameters to get the cleanest representation of the in-focus area. First, of course, you will need to screen grab the selected parts of the focus pull. For example, infinity, mid-focus, close field, and mins, for example. Do this for all apertures tested. Bring the images into Photoshop and go to Filter, Stylize, Find Edges. This test should reveal what the shape of your field looks like, its asymmetry if applicable, and what stop you get a clean, sharp path across an image in a straight line. You may also notice that the edges often have more depth of field than the center. My theory is that this is mechanical occlusion, the same thing that causes the cat-eye bokeh. With a smaller aperture near the edges, the depth also increases. This can easily be mistaken for issues with field curvature. You've probably heard how Cooke lenses are warm and how Zeiss lenses are cool. And neither of those things are particularly true, but it is true that no lens is perfectly neutral. What's most important is that your entire set should ideally match well. This way, your color temperature doesn't suddenly change when you swap a lens. For this test, you want a large enough gray card or chip chart. The white balance in the camera should exactly match your lighting precisely. That's why I used exactly and precisely in the same sentence, because it's that important. After acquiring the image, take it into Photoshop, Resolve, etc., and you're going to sample the center. You need to sample 3 times with 3 different areas within the center. A perfectly neutral reading will give you 128 at red, green, and blue. Higher number, there's more of something. A lower number, there's less of something. And this will allow you to figure out whether you have a warm lens, a cool lens, or something with a bit of a tint shift to it. Let's now move on to shooting people. In the Cine Lens manual, the authors break down a controlled in-lab test of human faces. Now, I've decided to exclude this test from this video because it's fairly comprehensive, and I really believe that if you need to do this test, which means that you are prepping to shoot a television series or a feature film, that you really should be buying this book. The elements of real-world testing that I'm going to discuss in this video is much more dumbed down and should serve sort of the average shooter. In the best case scenario, you will do a test, both exterior and interior, that matches the look and feel of your actual film. This, of course, could cost money, including set builds and actors' time, etc. So if you do not have a budget for that, then first try at least to get the actual actors to be available for the test, and if not possible, then anyone you know who shares a similar skin tone and are available. For this test, I just used my cousin Nev. Now, I encourage you to do lab tests before these tests. Arrive at some conclusions about the lenses so that you know what you're looking for in these real-world tests. And in these real-world tests, I'm looking not just for visual representation of what I observed in the lab, but also my emotional attachment to it. Again, there's no good or bad lens. There's just the right lens for the right feeling or story. Connect with your emotion here and continually ask yourself about how the properties you're observing make you feel. Does it feel right for the character and the story? Here are 3 elements that I'm most often looking at. First are going to be skin tones and color bias, which are the most important elements to get right. Some science has already been done to reveal that humans actually have an innate ability to isolate proper skin tones. So warm skin has been shown to evoke and increase attractiveness, while cooler skin evokes feelings of ill health. Thus, if we don't get it right, it can lead to an emotional reaction from the audience that we may not want. Sharpness and contrast can also be an issue, so too much detail can negatively affect skin tonality. For this reason, some lenses are actually tuned to soften anything within the red spectrum. Next, I turn to flaring, In your interior test, I advise you to place a Fresnel both behind your subject and another one off camera but hitting the lens. This will tell you how much of the flare, both spot and veiling, will affect your image. Well-coated lenses will exhibit small changes, and poorly coated lenses will completely obscure your image. At the time I tested, I did not do the rear Fresnel, but of course I suggest that you absolutely do it. When testing outside, I also suggest doing this on a sunny day where the sun is low enough to be in your shot, and then you can just simply reframe it out for the veiling flare. When looking at bokeh, this is where I'm looking for my emotional attachment to the bokeh. And by that I mean, is it soft and blended into the background, or is it overcorrected and harsh with soap bubble appearance? Both make me feel something different. I'm also looking for distracting aspheric onion rings, or in more vintage optics, the Petzval swirl associated with numerous aberrations like astigmatism and mechanical occlusion. There remains one final attribute worthy of mention at least, and this is the subject of three-dimensionality. You may have heard of this. This is the ability of one lens to represent depth better than another. A lens with poor three-dimensionality may make a ball look like a disc, or a nose look as though it's on the same plane as the eyes, whereas one with good dimensional representation gives you the feeling of space better. Don't feel bad if you don't see this. It's often very subtle and takes a trained eye and time. Let's move on to part 3 now, physical assessment. We're now on to our last chapter, and this section deals with the lens that's in your hand and the one that you and your camera assistants will physically have to interact with. Treat it like you're taking to a doctor for a physical checkup. You'll be assessing its health. Is it in good and reliable condition to use? As well, you'll be checking its weight and its strength. Finally, you'll be hedging all of this to its cost and how it affects the budget of your project. What we won't be covering in this is maintenance, service, or customization, because it's just far outside the bounds of this video, and I always recommend that you bring your lenses to qualified service technicians like Duclos lenses. Now, this is a simple one. You're assessing its overall design. For example, are you going to be handheld or on a gimbal for a significant period of time? So you may want to select, say, lighter mini primes, unless of course it affects the balance of your camera. A heavier lens can improve handheld control by giving your camera better balance on your shoulder, and more weight also reduces microshakes, but the same lenses may not be compatible with your gimbal. You also have to consider your shooting schedule. If the pace is quick and there may be some scenes that require more improv on the part of your camera team, then you may want to consider a zoom lens over a series of primes. Is it critical that you shoot at 1.5 or is T2.9 sufficient? Well, if you plan on parking your camera at 2.9 or 4, then a zoom most often will be a better choice. You also want to look at the other rigs you're using as well. So what fluid head you plan on using or any remote heads. Again, zooms are often a better choice with remote heads because you can change the focal length without bringing the head down, swapping, rebalancing. In our special considerations section at the end of this video, we're going to talk about some of the situations that can be outright deadly to your lens. For now, know that there are some things you should be looking for when you physically pick up a lens. The first thing to do is a full mechanical inspection. So you're going to roll each ring to ensure that it's operating smoothly. Next, you're going to look at the iris as you rotate the aperture ring to ensure all blades are operating smoothly and in sync. You'll also want to check the lens mount to see that it's not worn, broken, or bent, and that it is securely fastened onto the lens. The next thing you're going to do is to take a flashlight or your cell phone flashlight and shine it into the lens at an angle. Do not shine it directly at you. You're going to just illuminate the glass to check for fungus, significant dirt, grease, or damage. Now, fungus is the most pervasive, especially in older optics or optics used in humid areas and improperly stored. Fungus will show up as fuzzy little white dots or as a thin spider web. You'll also be looking for any significant amount of dust. Now, small dust particles are pervasive and fine and will never materialize in the image. However, testing will reveal if they're significant by looking at your bokeh, especially when the dust is closer to the exit pupil. And a final reminder that if you have any issues in the examination of your lens, to bring it to the attention of the service staff at your local rental house. If you own the lens, then either find out if you have a local service provider or send it to Duclos. I can only vouch for Duclos. Not everybody has unlimited budgets, and filmmaking, by and large, is the art of compromise. No one, even at the highest level, gets everything that they want. And this is why these tests are so valuable, because in your testing, you may discover that less expensive optics, where, say, the aberrations will never be seen by your audience, or the build quality is sufficient enough for your crew and your environment. Demanding better optics simply for the sake of it makes you a terrible and ignorant filmmaker. Knowing where to spend the money and then being able to demonstrate your reasons to a producer, well, my friends, that is worth its weight in gold. Listen, you still may not get what you want, but at least you tried. We're nearing the end of our journey here. You'll also want to consider your shooting conditions. Every part of the lens is subject to thermal changes. The term for this is athermalization. It's not only the metal that expands in heat, but it's also the glass and plastic. In less expensive lenses, this can significantly affect the lens's ability to hold focus, especially as the environmental temperature changes throughout the shot. Or it can cause aberrations due to optical elements shifting. The worst offenders of this are photography lenses, which are why so many of the larger photo lenses are painted white, not black. The more plastic your lens is, the more susceptible it will be to negative effects of thermal conditions. In the most extreme cases, excessive heat can cause your lens grease to liquefy and run, contaminating the optics and internal mechanics. On the inverse, special consideration needs to be taken when shooting in extreme cold. Extreme cold can cause the lens to constrict, restricting some of its functionality. Additionally, the grease can become nearly solid and all of your mechanics can freeze up. Some lenses can be re-greased before your shoot with a material better designed for the cold. This isn't a quick or cheap process, however. Lastly, extremely humid environments can come with a host of potential problems, not the least of which is fungus on the lens elements, while dry, dusty environments can force small particles into your lens, damaging your mechanism and the optics. Knowing what conditions you will be shooting in will prepare you to take adequate steps to protect your lenses and make any additional gear selections or alterations that will ensure your lenses remain working. And just to reiterate, this video isn't a comprehensive guide, nor is it a finite guide. There are many tests you can do that are not in this video, and there are other ways of qualifying the results by other means. I highly encourage you, for the final time, to purchase the Cine Lens Manual if you are serious about your career as a cinematographer. I also encourage you to seek out media talks or personal appearances by either Jay Holben, Christopher Pops ASC, or Matthew Duclos. These guys continually share their immense knowledge with our community at large. And with that, I want to leave you with this moment of Zen, courtesy of Jay Holben.
I had a really, really fascinating experience at one of the ASC Lens Days where we had a group of optical designers standing behind the monitor watching cinematographers test lenses. And they're standing back and they're watching the monitor as one lens goes up and they're like, oh, that's horrible. Look at that. Look at the chromatic aberration and distortion. It's terrible. And then another lens comes up and they're, yes, look, it's clean, it's perfect. And then the cinematographers are saying, I hate it. Give me back that other one. Yeah, this is the one. And the optical designers, their brains are melting. Saying, wait, it's completely wrong. But the artist is responding to that on a different level. There's a disparity between technical performance and precision and creative decisions. And sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. So you have to be able to differentiate. But I want to know what those technical performances are so that I'm better informed about the creative decisions I make.
And that is it, my friends. Thank you so much for sticking around. And please, as always, comment and subscribe if you like content like this, because if you don't comment and subscribe, the people who pay me will tell me to stop wasting their money on this kind of stuff. And I love nothing more than wasting their money on this kind of stuff. So for me, for now, I'm out. Peace. I'm going this way this time.